3, 2, 1. All right, welcome back. We're going to continue talking about specific neurotransmitters now that we've covered some of the basics of what neurotransmitters do when they get to the receptor, focusing on acetylcholine and norepinephrine. And in this talk, we're going to understand what both of those neurotransmitters do in the central and peripheral nervous system, and specifically to understand why anticholinergic side effects, which you're probably familiar with, of medications are so common and why they can be such a problem for patients. Now, what is acetylcholine? Now, acetylcholine is one of these that goes by many different names. So when people refer to cholinergic or anticholinergic, they're talking about the acetylcholine receptors. And this is the primary parasympathetic neurotransmitter. So if you recall, the parasympathetic is the parallel to the sympathetic nervous system, sympathetic being fight or flight. Parasympathetic is more the freeze, but also the relax, digest, breed portion of our autonomic nervous system. And so in the central nervous system, so that is to say in the brain, the acetylcholine is very important for cognition and memory. And when we begin to block those receptors, one of the things that we often see is an impairment in cognition. Anybody who's ever taken an antihistamine that has a centrally acting anticholinergic effect like Benadryl can probably relate to this. In the peripheral nervous system, it has more to do with skeletal muscle control and, as I mentioned, the autonomic nervous system parasympathetic branch. This is originating from the basal forebrain, and it's synthesized, it's actually made from the amino acids choline and acetate. And it's broken down by cholinesterase, which will become relevant when we talk about treating dementia. We use cholinesterase inhibitors. So there's an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine called cholinesterase, and that is akin to monoamine oxidase in antidepressants. So we inhibit that enzyme to try and make more acetylcholine available. There are two types of receptors for acetylcholine. There are nicotinic and muscarinic. They are sometimes referred to as, so you'll see them abbreviated as M or ACHM or ACHN. So these acetylcholine receptors, these the two types, as I mentioned, the nicotinic are those ion channels that open up and allow positive or negatively charged ions to flow in. Okay, and they're called nicotinic because nicotine binds more readily to them than muscarine. So these are some of the earliest neurotransmitter systems to be identified. And they're, as I mentioned, they're very important in cognition. And this is a primary target for both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system activity. Now, muscarinic receptors are a little more complicated. They are G protein coupled receptors. So once they are turned on, there's that cascade effect that happens within the cell. And as the name would imply, they are more activated readily by muscarine, which comes from well, you can find muscarine in Amanita muscarina mushrooms. And atropine is also where the target of atropine are muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. There are actually 5 different subtypes, and these are the when we block these, we get a lot of anticholinergic effects like dry mouth, blurry vision, urinary retention, constipation, etc. And a lot of those side effects that I described are very common with many of our medications because of this inadvertent side effect of blocking acetylcholine receptors. So these are things such as tricyclics and some antipsychotics. Now, sometimes we specifically are interested in blocking the cholinergic receptors, as we do with, say, benzotropine, or also known as cogentin. And as I mentioned earlier, we block the breakdown enzyme of cholinesterase with the anticholinesterase inhibitors of, say, something like Aricept or donepezil. And we can also use this target for the nicotinic receptors in a drug called I can pronounce that, Chantix, which is, we use that for smoking cessation. So that is a specific, so alpha-4 beta-2 nicotinic, so that's a subtype of the receptor where that drug binds. So as you can see, they're a very specific target to help people quit smoking. Now, let's turn our attention to a different neurotransmitter, which is norepinephrine. So norepinephrine is a monoamine, and you'll hear that term thrown around a lot. So there's more detail in the Khan Academy videos, which are attached to the website, if you want to understand what monoamine means. But norepinephrine is the primary sympathetic neurotransmitter. So if acetylcholine is the thing that activates the parasympathetic nervous system, this is the primary activator of the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, excuse me. And in the central nervous system, this has a big effect on both mood and attention. And we exploit that fact by using this pathway as both an antidepressant and also in attention improving drugs such as amphetamine or Adderall. And in the peripheral nervous system, this, as I mentioned, it's the primary sympathetic nervous system activators. So you can understand why this would trigger the fight or flight type of symptoms. So you can see tachycardia, hypertension, etc. This comes from the locus ceruleus, which is at the top of the brainstem there. So you can see that blue arrow originating from the top of the brainstem, and it's actually synthesized from dopamine. So dopamine is broken down to make norepinephrine, and it's broken down further by monoamine oxidase, or MAO. And there are 4 types of receptors for norepinephrine, alpha 1 and 2 and beta 1 and 2. And there are subtypes of the alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptor types, so you can count those up for yourself. But there are many subtypes of noradrenergic receptors, and these can be used as different drug targets depending on what effect we want to have. So these are the most common ones with regards to mental health. So this would be the alpha-2 receptors are probably the most common thing, and there are 3 types. So there's alpha-2A, alpha-2B, and alpha-2C. Alpha-2A is probably the most commonly targeted receptor with regards to psychiatry, because this is the drug. This is where things such as clonidine will be attracted to. So this will have downstream effects on attention and behavior and some emotional states as well. But this can also have the side effect of sedation and lowering blood pressure. So most of the time, these drugs are used by our colleagues in primary care and cardiology to address hypertension. Now, when we get too much norepinephrine going on, as I mentioned earlier, we can have things like tachycardia and hypertension. You can have a hyperalertness. You can have sweating. But decreased noradrenergic tone, you'll notice I use the term norepinephrine and noradrenergic synonymously, which is a fairly common convention, is thought to be associated with things like poor attention and concentration and memory, perhaps depressed mood, and a psychomotor retardation or slowing. And if you remember back to the previous talk, I discussed how there is tonic firing of most neurons, and that is particularly true in the norepinephrine. So there's that sort of steady state of that steady boop, boop, boop that's firing. When we get into a activated sort of threat response, for example, if I'm walking in class and a tiger jumps out, those norepinephrine neurons are going to start firing, boop, 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 and that's going to cause me to become very vigilant. It's going to allow me to run, perhaps fight. It's going to get me ready to try and save my own life. And we think that there may be an excess of noradrenergic activity in people that have anxiety and people that have panic responses. Now, the drugs that are most relevant to norepinephrine in psychiatry, there is really a class of 1 of norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which would be bupropion or Wellbutrin. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we sometimes will block alpha and beta adrenergic or norepinephrine receptors with things that are often thought of as blood pressure medications. So propranolol, for example, for performance anxiety, clonidine and prazosin are sometimes used to address the hyper alertness that you see in PTSD and other kind of anxiety presentations. And then we also use a norepinephrine reuptake inhibiting drug called atomoxetine or Strattera for the purposes of treating ADHD. So it's a non-stimulant, non-amphetamine attention improving drug that incidentally was tried out as an antidepressant but didn't work very well, but it was found to have some effect on concentration and attention. So that's where it got an FDA approval. So in closing, acetylcholine is really important for cognition and autonomic nervous system control. And so when we block that, we see all sorts of untoward side effects, such as constipation and dry mouth. And unfortunately, a lot of these anticholinergic side effects are present in psychiatric medications. And this can be really problematic, especially if you are older, because as we get older, we become more susceptible to the effects of acetylcholine blockade. So this is where we can see anticholinergic delirium, for example. And then finally, we need norepinephrine for both arousal, but also for the benefit of mood. And we sometimes target this for not only depression, but also blocking certain receptors to address aspects of anxiety. Thank you.